Good evening and welcome. How strange it is to be standing up here where in April I stood and said I was retiring. It was indeed true, and I've spent a very enjoyable intervening few months, but I'm here today to introduce the evening of eminent speakers from the academic and museum worlds who've come together to honor one of the great characters of the Islamic art field, and to speak briefly myself about Sheikh Nasser al-Sabah and his relationship with Kresties and the market. My brief introduction will be followed by vignettes about very different aspects of Sheikh Nasser, from Sue Strong of the Victoria and Albert Museum, Dr. Oliver Watson, also originally from the V&A and then director of the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, by Professor Doris Behrens Abu Saif, formerly Nasser D. Khalili Chair of Islamic Art and Archaeology at SOAS and a prolific author in the field, Dr. Julian Raby, former director of the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, now combined as the National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C., still involved in numerous projects, and by Dr. Surem Malikian, scholar, exhibition organizer, author of numerous books and articles, and former International Herald Tribune arts correspondent. Our final speaker is Katie Marsh, a person who's been a linchpin of Sheikh Nasser's activities, artistic and otherwise, for many decades, and it's through Katie that this evening has been facilitated. Each individual presentation is short, with no introductions for the speakers individually beyond this, and the whole time is intended to last under an hour, which should give you time to enjoy the art surrounding us and to savor the hospitality provided with the very generous assistance of Sheikh Nasser's family, some of whom I'm delighted to welcome here. I first heard of Sheikh Nasser from my father, a little time before I joined Kresties. Here was a young man who'd come into the field of Islamic art, an Arab who was buying at the very highest level. He'd bought a painting that my father thought was probably his favorite image from the entire field. But this was, of course, just one of the many works of art that the young Sheikh Nasser was buying in the later 1970s. A few years ago, I met the heir from whom this painting was purchased. He still remembered vividly the appearance of this charming Arab client who arrived, introduced and accompanied by Oliver Hoare. And that painting was only one of a number of hugely important items that changed hands in that one purchase. I was also at Kresties, but not for quite long enough to be invited to Kuwait for the opening of the museum exhibition in 1983. All my other colleagues came back with stories of the phenomenal 3 days that surrounded it. Julian, who was there, is going to tell us more about it. My memories are principally from my colleagues and my parents. My father must have enjoyed it thoroughly, as many people told me how he'd broken out into song at the end of one evening. Sheikh Nasser was not only buying works of art. His investment office, which was at that time where Katie worked, was actively and subtly buying up shares in Kresties, which had only recently gone public. This was done under various names, but there came a time where his combined holdings reached and exceeded the limit above which you have to declare yourself, and so he became known. My first encounter with this phenomenal collector, who's also part owner of the company, was for me completely unexpected, but in hindsight, very typical. He came into the front counter, unannounced, and wanted to see what we had in the warehouse. At that time, the Islamic sales at Kresties were, to be honest, not particularly impressive, and the warehouse was relatively bare. But I remember well his coming down and taking pleasure in this relatively unassuming engraved tinned copper bowl, handling it carefully, rolling it over in his hands, and loving the intricacy of the engraving. And it was that personal touch that really made an impact on me that first time. But the love of not just the masterpiece, but also the academic fragment, I believe is something that Oliver is going to say more about. I became more aware of it when I and our consultant, the late lovely Rafe Pinder-Wilson, traveled together to Kuwait to go through the Kofler Truniger collection of Islamic art. There were, of course, masterpieces, like the piece on the left, but it was the inclusion of fragments like the other 4 items on the screen that he loved taking time off from his work to discuss with Rafe. Time and time again at auction, he would suggest He would select fascinating items that were not necessarily masterpieces, but which were very rare and demonstrated features not seen elsewhere. The two jades on the screen are typical. The dagger handle has a later blade, but the hilt was made in the royal workshop of Shah Ismail I. The bowl on the left, albeit lacking the inlay, was one that only Sheikh Nasser recognized as being far earlier than the 17th century date it was given in the catalogue. Sheikh Nasser was a man of principle. Early in my career at Christie's, when we went to the warehouse to catalogue what had come in the previous week, this carpet that's on the screen was waiting for us. It had been consigned without any prior notification. Those were the days when business was easy. Sheikh Nasser happened to be in London just before its auction and came to the view. At that stage, he was not well known by sight, and so could overhear a group of dealers discussing this same huge Mughal Pashmina lattice carpet. They were going to buy it and cut it up. It would make many wonderful fragments. Sheikh Nasser was absolutely determined that this should not happen, and so gave Katie Marsh an unlimited budget with which to buy it. He was going to restore it, but every 10 years he found out quite how much it was going to cost and deferred the commitment. As an amusing coincidence, 2 weeks before the auction, the wreck of King Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose, had been raised from the seabed amid great media excitement. Sheikh Nasser referred to this carpet as his Mary Rose. At this point, I'd also like to add that Sheikh Nasser would really have appreciated the wonderful Mughal Pashmina lattice carpet dating from Shah Jahan's reign that we have in the sale on view downstairs in the St. James's galleries. It is a really wonderful example, both historically and aesthetically, the finest Mughal carpet to have been offered on the market in decades, with fabulous drawing. It's downstairs, and don't miss it while you are here. End of commercial break. Even when Sheikh Nasser wanted to buy something, it was very rare that he was prepared to bid without limit. When the wonderful Indian enamel gold-covered cup and saucer from the collection of the third Marquess of Bute came onto the market, Sheikh Nasser ended up as the underbidder, at 20 times the admittedly very low estimate, losing out to Simon Ray. Simon, however, knew that Sheikh Nasser really wanted it, and over the period of what ended up as years, Sheikh Nasser would intermittently ask Simon about it. His persistence paid off, and eventually he did end up as the buyer. On another occasion, he was very interested by this velvet, which we had estimated at £150,000. It's a very good example of an extremely rare group and had wonderful provenance, but it was in very fragile condition. Lots of clients, including Sheikh Nasser, were interested in it before the sale, but none actually bid in the room. Immediately after the sale, we had 4 separate people, all of whom really wanted to buy it. And on this occasion, we determined with all 4, each should put in sealed final bids, and we would sell it to the highest bidder for one auction increment above the next highest bid. Sheikh Nasser at this stage put in a bid that was all but double the estimate and miles above any competitor. He certainly could be competitive on occasions. And of course, this became clear when in 1997, Sheikh Saud al-Thani entered the market like a whirlwind. It was physically apparent to all of us in our first Arts of India sale. Sheikh Saud sat in the center of the auction room, bidding on most of the top lots. Sheikh Nasser's team were in the back corner of the room. The eventual selling prices became very hard to predict. And fairly quickly, Sheikh versus Sheikh was the apparent driving force behind the market, although this was a vast oversimplification of the market at the time. When it did occur, however, it resulted in prices such as that of the carved wood octagonal panel here, which made more than 100 times the estimate. When Sheikh Saud did leave the market as rapidly as he'd entered it in the middle of 2004, Sheikh Nasser is reported to have commented that now Saud was out, he too would sit out the market and wait for prices to come down. The next 2 years were indeed a bit flat, but by 2007, prices were on the rise again, 2005 and 6 had actually been a very good, if brief, opportunity to buy. Sheikh Nasser, however, was not directly excited by personal competition. He was never happier than sitting in his informal diwan area in Sukhauchi's office in Mapula, or later in Yarmouk in Kuwait, sitting with and discussing and enjoying his works of art. The excitement with which he'd produce his new purchases to astonish the lucky visitors were tangible and infectious. As time went on, his interests moved more into the field of antiquities, and I still vividly remember him almost throwing these lions at me as we sat on the sofas there, loving the shock on my face as I was encouraged to pick them up. That sense of fun never left him, and always puts a smile on my face when I think of him with his collection. Throughout this entire journey, Sheikh Nasser was accompanied by Sheikh Hussa. Undoubtedly, it was Sheikh Nasser who formed the collection, but Sheikh Hussa who's helped publicize it, ensuring a series of lectures and publications, and frequently being the public face of the collection. She's had a pivotal role in its creation and continuing development. They were a beautiful team for such a venture. And I shall now hand over to the others to talk about some of the works of art and other events that Sheikh Nasser managed to achieve in his remarkable life, starting with Sue.